All right, well, last time where we left off with Pastor Jay, David had a spear hurled at his head, right? So if you remember last time, or if you watched the last video, I'd encourage you, go back, watch it. Pastor Jay shares with us the story of King Saul throwing a spear at David's head when David literally did nothing wrong. But here we are after that, and the spear is thrown at David's head, and then David runs off into the wilderness. And today, in our conversation, I want to talk about the idea of the wilderness or the desert. Now, what's interesting about this is we think like, okay, David ran into the desert, he was there for a couple days, and then he came back, conquered Saul, and he was king. Actually, according to historians, David was in the desert from the time the spear was thrown till he came back to the kingdom for 15 years. 15 years he was running around in the desert, away from Saul, fighting enemies, fighting other people, conquering places, hiding, lots of conflict. And you can read all of that in 1 Samuel. But what's interesting is I believe that there's times where we see something like this where David's in the desert and we just assume it's a blip on the radar when it's actually a huge part of his story. And today, in my encouragement for you today, I want to talk about this idea of the desert. And I want to talk about how we as Christians view our seasons of life in the desert. Now, just to give some understanding of what I mean by when I say the word desert, I want to read you a couple definitions from the dictionary. The first one is this idea of wilderness. So in the Bible, often the words wilderness, desert, they kind of imply the same thing. So in the English, I want to give you the definitions of both. So for wilderness, it means a wilderness is a neglected or abandoned area of a garden or a town. So a place without life. Or to be in the wilderness is to be in a position of disfavor. So to be out of favor with someone. Like when you ask a girl on the date, she says no, you are now in a relational wilderness with that girl, okay? It's not gonna work. Anyway, desert is, now the idea of desert is this. The desert is a dry, barren area of land, especially one covered with sand, that is characteristically desolate, waterless, and without vegetation. So if we flip this into a spiritual analogy, which is what the Bible is doing here, it's saying when David is out in the wilderness, he is in a place that is desolate, without water, without life, a place that doesn't have much hope or anything growing around. Now, as I describe a desert, you've probably, in your mind, come up with seasons in your life where you felt the same way, where you felt like God was far away, where you felt like everything bad was happening to you, where you feel like everyone around you was gone, that all you had was loss in your life. Maybe even this last year, you experienced the isolation of the desert. You experienced loss of people or of things or of goals, or maybe you're in school and you didn't get a graduation, you didn't get certain things in 2020 that you wish or you thought you would have. There's a lot of things that can be for us a season of being in the desert. And when I think about David, not just being in the desert for a few days, but for 15 years, what's interesting is it made me think back to how old I was when I was 15 years old. Now, reverse the clock. When I was 15 years old, or 15 years ago, I was 14 years old. Oh, math is hard. Pretty soon 15, but I was 14 years old. And so as I was thinking about this idea of like, from the age of 4, if I was in the desert from the age of 14 till now, what would that be like? Would I still be a Christian? Would I still believe the promises that God gave for me like David did, believing that he would be king? Would I try to take things into my own hands? Would I try to, or would I trust him? And when I look over the last 15 years of my life, if I really think about it, I've been going through different seasons of deserts. Now I could go through and list off the different disappointments, heartbreaks, where my plans didn't go the way I thought it would, where I went to school and didn't have the finances, where there's all these different things that caused me to doubt, to feel alone, to be in isolation. Times at Bible college, when I graduated Bible college and I couldn't get a job. You're like, all right, God, I followed you here, and then now you left me with nothing. I could talk about the times where I'm working at Chick-fil-A at 12:30 in the morning with a Bible degree, wondering what I'm doing. And as I look over the 15 years, I could honestly say there have been times over and over again where long stretches of time I found myself in the desert. And so as I was thinking about that, what got impressed on me is there's really one idea. If I was 14, where I am now, what I would tell myself when I was 14 when it comes to the desert, and it's this: desire the desert. That's what I would tell myself. Desire the desert. Yeah, you heard me right. Not run away from the desert, not try to plant some plants in the middle of the sand, but desire the desert. Embrace it. Because I remember and recall seasons of my life where bad things happened, and it made me run from God. It made me doubt Him, and it made me question my faith. And in those seasons, I really wish I would have embraced the desert instead of ran from it. I really wish I would have embraced the lessons that God wanted to teach me instead of ignoring it or blaming Him. And today for you guys, it's just a simple idea. I want you to desire the deserts that are going to come into your life. And why am I saying that? Not because I'm a crazy person, not because I'm Bear Grylls, although maybe I could be. Nah, I'm not. But because God leads His faithful into the desert. I desire the desert because I know God will lead me into the desert. Yeah, God leads you into those bad seasons. How do I know? 2 situations that I'll read off for you just right now. One in the New Testament, one in the Old Testament. In Matthew 4, it says this. It says, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit, led by God, into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." It didn't say Jesus went off on his own, chasing things, and then he found himself in the wilderness and he was tempted. It said God led him out there because God leads His faithful into the deserts. In the Old Testament, you might be familiar with the story of Job. But this is what it says about Job in the first chapter, before 40 chapters, almost 40 chapters full of suffering. Chapter 1, it says, "Then Lord asked Satan, 'Have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil.'" See, God leads us into the desert to reveal to us the condition of our faith. Why do I now desire the desert? Why do I now want to desire the times of suffering? Why do I embrace those? Because in those times, I see the condition of my faith clearly. See, without suffering, we cannot see and test where our relationship with God is. And God leads us into the desert to give us a better faith. So today, I just want to give you 4 quick reasons of why you could desire the desert, why you should desire the desert. Why God would lead us into the desert. The first thing is, the desert demands dependency. The desert demands dependency. What do I mean by that? Matthew 4, this is the temptation of Jesus still. Verses 2 through 4 says this. It says, "For 40 days and 40 nights," talking about Jesus, "he fasted and became very hungry." So Jesus was out without food for 40 days. I go 40 minutes and I'm hangry. Jesus went 40 days without food. And then verse 3 says, "During that time, the devil came and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become loaves of bread.' But Jesus told him," and here's the key here, "No, the scriptures say people do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." See, the desert demands dependency on God. For you, for me, when you experience that loss and pain in your life, you can choose to either trust God with it or take matters into your own hands. You can choose to say that God's going to provide the bread, He's going to provide the sustenance, I'm going to depend on Him, or you're going to make it yourself. See, Jesus could have easily brought up some bread and ate, but He said, no, I'm going to depend on God instead. See, blaming God for our problems, blaming God for our suffering, blaming God for our lack is in our human nature. It's our natural instinct. It's what we do. When we see disaster, when there's tragedy, when there's pain, when we're in the desert, our natural reaction is to blame God. But I want to challenge you, instead of blaming God and pushing Him away, as a Christian in tragedy, in the desert, lean into God. Trust Him more. And watch what He will do. And I know these 2 reactions are in human nature because we see it actually in Job chapter 2. After Job has lost all of his family members, Job has also gotten sick. He's scabs all over his body. He's sitting, in torn up clothes. He's in despair. And here's two reactions that are happening that I want you to catch. Job 2, 8 through 10 says this. It says, Job was scraping his skin with a piece of broken pottery as he sat among the ashes. So he had burned his clothes. He's sitting in the ashes of his burnt clothes. Symbolically, his burnt up life. There's nothing left of his life. All he has left is his body, and even his body is failing him. So he's sitting here and he's scraping the scabs off of his skin with broken pottery. It's like using a pop cap to like scrape off, zits or something. And verse 9 says this, his wife, who was the only family member left alive, his wife said this to Job. She said, are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die. See, that's natural human reaction to tragedy. That's natural human reaction to loss. We all experience that if we've lost someone or we lost something or we face disappointment. It says, why are you still trusting God? Curse him and just go die. But when you embrace the desert, when you desire to have the desert, there's a different reaction you can have. And this is where Job shows us the reaction. In verse 10, Job says, you talk like a foolish woman. Should we accept only good things from the hand of God, but never anything bad? So in all of this, Job said nothing wrong. See, in the deserts of our lives, we can choose to have more dependency on God. Because like I said, God leads his faithful through the deserts to show us the condition of our faith. So in that moment, you can choose, do I reject God? Do I curse God because things didn't go my way? Or do I lean into God? Do I trust him? See, the desert seasons are given to us to show us how much we need God, that we don't have the strength to make it, and gives us the choice to depend on him instead of ourselves. See, the desert demands dependency, but also the sand of suffering produces strength. So here's the second reason you should desire the desert, because living in sand produces strength. Romans 5 says this, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance. Endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And this hope will not lead to disappointment, for we know how God has dearly loved us because he has given us the Holy Spirit to fill our hearts with love. See, God allows you to travel through the desert, to experience the sand of suffering, to strengthen your faith, to make you stronger in life. Now, have you ever been running on the beach, or you're in the sand, you're playing soccer, you're playing volleyball, sand volleyball, and your legs hurt more than just being in regular ground, right? You play volleyball on the grass and you're fine, but all of a sudden you play volleyball in the sand and you can't jump as high, can't push as hard, it takes a lot more effort. See, that's the two contrasts of seasons of life we're in. Sometimes we're in good seasons of life and we're just on normal ground and life is good and the grass is green. And sometimes we're in the sand of suffering and every step is a little heavier. Every action is a little harder. Every decision takes a little bit more work. But only strength comes to those who commit to God throughout that season of sand and suffering. So there's this guy named David Goggins, and let me tell you a little bit about him. He's an accomplished athlete. He's completed over 60 ultra marathons, triathlons, and ultra triathlons, setting course records and regularly placing in the top 5. He once had the Guinness World Record for number of push-ups in 17 hours. He had 4,030 push-ups in 17 hours. Now, in one of his books that he wrote, David Goggins said this. He said, our whole life is set up in the path of least resistance. We don't want to suffer. We don't want to feel discomfort. So the whole time we live our lives in a very comfortable area, but there's no growth in that. You want to strengthen your relationship with God? Embrace suffering. Strengthen yourself. Push yourself to a place of uncomfortableness. You might have seen the quote around that says, seek discomfort. Discomfort brings strength. And spiritual discomfort in suffering brings strength in your relationship with God. You know why I'm happy about the deserts in my life? and why I'll embrace the deserts in the future. Because in those seasons, I can look back and I can see how I was dependent on God, and I can see how those seasons strengthened me and made me a better Christian. Because although I did it badly, although walking in the sand was difficult, although I stumbled around trying to find God, I was faithful to Him, and He strengthened me for that. See, if you want to know the condition of your faith, how strong you are as a Christian, go through something difficult and watch how you live. Then you'll know. The third thing is, the heat of testing refines trust. The heat of testing refines your trust. When the pressure's on, when the heat is on, it refines you to trust God more and more. It's interesting because in engineering, there's this idea that they use fire, or I guess smelting, whatever you want to call it, use fire on a metal to raise the impurities to the top. And then once you raise the impurities to the top, you scrape it off. And the hotter the fire, the more impurities that you clean out. And see, God uses the fire of testing in the desert to burn the impurities out of you. Let me say that again. God uses the fire of testing to burn the impurities out of you. Why should you embrace the desert? Because I don't know if you're like me, there's a lot of impurities in me that I want burnt out. There's a lot of things in my life that I want to come to the surface so I can allow God to get rid of them. There's a lot of things in me that I don't like, that I know are wrong, that I know are limited, that I know are sinful, that through testing, I want God to bring up and burn out of me. Because I'd rather experience suffering for 15 years of my life and be more like Christ than have 15 years of comfort right on my way of separation from God. I'd much rather do that. What's interesting in 1 Peter 4, Peter says this, he says, dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you are going through, as if something strange is happening to you. Instead, be very glad, for these trials make you partners with Christ in His suffering, so that you will have a wonderful joy of seeing His glory when it is revealed to all the world. And if you are insulted because you bear the name of Christ, you will be blessed. For the glorious Spirit of God rests upon you. And if you suffer, however, it must not be for murder or stealing or making trouble or prying into other people's affairs, but no, it is no shame to suffer for being a Christian. Praise God for the privilege of being called by His name. For the time has come for judgment, and it must begin in God's household. And if judgment begins with us, what terrible fate awaits those who have never obeyed God's good news. And also, if the righteous are barely saved, what happens to the godless sinners? Verse 19, so if you are suffering in a manner that pleases God, keep on doing what is right and trust your lives to the God who created you, for He will never fail you. If you find yourself suffering today for doing right and you've been walking with God, He's led you there. So allow this to be an opportunity to trust Him. See, the desert demands dependency. The sand of suffering brings us strength. The fiery trials make you trust. And the last thing is the journey will transform you. When you go through the desert, the journey will transform you. Isaiah 43:18-19 says, remember not the former things, nor consider the old things. Verse 19, behold, I am doing a new thing, and now it springs forth. Do you not see it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Stop asking God to end your desert and start asking Him to guide you on the way. Stop asking God to get you out of a problem or a trial or a suffering when you've been walking with Him. Instead, ask Him to continue to guide you, to make you more like Himself, to transform you. See, there's two ways to see a desert: punishment or discipline, punishment or opportunity, despair or growth. How you view a desert will dictate how you experience it. Our perception affects our experience. And when you trust God and stay faithful in a season of disappointment, loss, or despair, or a desert, you will be more like Him and you will experience Him more deeply. I'm not just saying that because it says it in the Bible, I'm saying it because I saw it. I see it in my own life. Because of my sufferings, because of the bad times in my life over the last 15 years, I know God better, I experience Him better, and I trust him more. So desire the desert. Go there. Allow God to lead you there. Don't push it away. Don't repel it. Embrace it. And he will transform your life every single time. He will refine you every single time. You will trust him more every single time. You will not regret embracing and desiring the deserts of your life. And the final just side note as we're wrapping up here is this verse. 1 Corinthians 13:3 says, if I gave everything to the poor and I even sacrificed my body, I could boast about it. But if I did not love others, I would gain nothing. See, we desire the desert not for our own punishment. We desire the desert out of love for God and love for other people. I go through the desert. Why I'm happy I'll go through the desert is because I love God more and I love the people God has put in my life better. Not for the sake of suffering, but for the sake of others. My life is better for others. My life is better for God because of the deserts. And if you're in a desert right now, I want to share this with you. God will make you exactly who He wants you to be. So depend on Him, be strengthened, trust the process, and watch your life be transformed.